Hello everyone, welcome to today's live broadcast, The Teen Brain, Insights from Neuroimaging. I am Judy O'Rourke of LabRoots and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Today's educational web seminar is presented by LabRoots, the leading scientific social networking website and provider of virtual events and webinars advancing scientific collaboration and learning. We have a few important announcements before we begin. This webcast is designed to be interactive and we encourage you to ask questions during the event. You can submit questions by typing them in the Q&A box, which can be found by clicking on the green Q&A button at the lower left of the presentation window. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can. You can enlarge the slide window by clicking on the screen icon in the lower right-hand corner of the slide window. If you have any technical problems viewing or hearing this presentation, please click on the support button at the top right of your presentation window, or submit your problem through the green Q&A button lower left. This is an educational webinar and thus offers free continuing education credits. After the webinar is over, please click on the CE button located in the bottom left-hand corner of the web page and follow the process of obtaining your credits. I would now like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Giedd. Dr. Giedd was a postgraduate fellow in the Child and Adolescent Psychiatry program at Duke University School of Medicine from 1989 to 1991, and then accepted a position as clinical staff fellow at the Child Psychiatry branch of the National Institute of Mental Health, NIMH. He was promoted to senior staff clinician at the NIMH in 1997, and he was named the chief of the brain imaging section in 2001. In 2010, he was appointed adjunct professor at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Dr. Giedd is board certified in general psychiatry by the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology, with added qualifications in geriatric psychiatry, and by the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. Please refer to Dr. Giedd's image in the top left corner of your screen for more information about him. I will now turn it over to Dr. Giedd for his presentation.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. My name is Giedd. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the teen brain and how its changeability makes it a time of vulnerability, but also of enormous opportunity. When I tell people what I'm going to be talking about, I tend to get some unsolicited feedback, such as this should be a very short talk. You mean they found one? Isn't that a contradiction of terms? Or along this theme of search for the elusive, my next talk will be about the Loch Ness Monster. But what I hope to convince you is that the teen brain is not broken, not defective. It's as it should be. This notion that teen brain is an oxymoron, that is an example of biology gone wrong, is reinforced in several books, such as The Primal Teen. Get out of my life, but first could you drive me and Cheryl to the mall? Now I know why tigers eat their young, and more straight to the point, yes, your teen is crazy, but teens do have brains, and with modern technologies such as magnetic resonance imaging, we can, for the first time, look under the hood at the living, growing brain. And what we've found is that the teen brain is not broken. In fact, it's pretty amazing. If you remember nothing else from this presentation, what I hope you remember that the adolescent brain, it's not a broken or defective adult brain. It's not half-baked. It's not just simply between a childhood and an adult brain. It has been exquisitely forged by evolution to have features that are different than the brain of a child, and different than the brain of an adult, but these features have served our species very, very well. And so, what I'd like to convey to you that the teen brain is really amazing in terms of its ability to learn, to adapt, to change. Across all social mammals, adolescents have these three features: increased risk-taking, increased sensation-seeking, which at first sounds very similar, but they're subtly different, and a move away from parents toward peers. These, I think, are deeply, deeply rooted in our biology because they're not just humans. All social mammals exhibit these three behaviors. It's always speculative to have like an evolutionary why reason, but one of the leading thoughts is that these features allow us to leave home, which is a very irrational decision in many, many ways. Our parents love us, they support us, they feed us, they protect us. It's very irrational to want to leave that environment. But by doing so, then there's more chance of meeting other people, of less inbreeding, which has genetic evolutionary advantages. So it's not so much of a moral right or wrong. It's just that it works better if the genes are more diversely integrated, if there's greater variability. So we wouldn't be well served to try to eliminate these features in terms of they're so deeply rooted in our biology, but we want to keep them non-lethal. We want to harness these behavioral tendencies for good and minimize the risk for dangers in terms of car accidents, firearms, drugs, a lot of these new risk factors that weren't really there when our brains were evolving. So this is from museum, the Smithsonian Museum that's close to where I used to live before moving to San Diego. That's a really, I think, wonderful exhibit. And as part of this was looking at the change in human brain size. The last big change is about 500 to 800,000 years ago. And this is a subtle but important point to make. What was behind the big change was not the harshness of the climate, but the change in climate itself. And so before seeing this, I was thinking, wow, it got really cold. Only the most robust amongst us could survive. Only the most clever could find a way to stay warm, to find food, to be able to reproduce. But what this is showing is that it's not the harshness of the climate, but the rapid change itself. And so everybody listening to this presentation had teenage ancestors whose brains were very good at adapting to change. And this is in contrast to our very close genetic cousins, the Neanderthals. And Neanderthal brains were actually about 13% larger than human brains. And they survived in some very difficult conditions. And a surprising amount can be learned from studying fossilized teeth. It's actually in some ways redundant because everybody's teeth at this moment are fossilized in the sense of being calcified, mineralized cells. But teeth, like trees, have growth rings. And for trees, it's called dendrochronology. And you can map out the growth each year in terms of years that had a lot of water or good growth conditions have larger rings, years that there was less rainfall, less growth, shorter rings, and you can get very precise correlation amongst different trees in terms of identifying the exact years of growth and climate. But you can also do this for teeth, and teeth also have growth rings. And it's a very good indication of maturation. So as long as you are having these growth rings, as long as the teeth are growing, then you're still maturing. And when the growth rings stop, that's an indication of maturation. So if you find a 12-year-old Neanderthal fossilized tooth in a cave, he'll be likely to be with his children, not his parents. And this is framed in often as surprisingly rapid growth in Neanderthals. But I think that's the wrong way to look at it. What's surprising is the protracted growth in humans. We're the outliers. We're the ones that are very different than any other species. A very long time of being protected by our parents. So 30% of college graduates live back at home for at least a year. And I'm not criticizing that. There are very good financial and other reasons why that may be the right thing to do. But even before modern college and education things, compared to any other species, we have a long time of protection from our parents. It's one of the most distinctive things about humans. And in general, across mammals, even across avians, the longer the period of protection from parents, the better the brain, in terms of more complicated food gathering strategies, more complicated social structure, more complicated problem-solving behaviors. But it's a trade-off. But we have this very long time where we can, in a sense, keep options open. The human brain can adapt to incredible different environments. We can live on the North Pole, we can live on the equator, almost everywhere in between. We can even live in outer space for a little while with technologies that our brains have developed. And so it's this ability to adapt and change that was so essential for our survival. Neanderthal brains didn't have this adaptability. Their tool use hardly changed at all for about 200,000 years. And of course, there was inbreeding. We're all a little bit Neanderthal. But one of, I think, the most critical differences between Neanderthals and humans is teenagers. Human teenagers having this very stretched out period where their brain can figure out what is the demands of this environment. Is it to stay warm, to find calories in a frigid, cold environment? Is it to find out what fruits and vegetables are edible in a warmer environment? I mean, it's phenomenally adaptable. And I think that adaptability is really being put to the test now with the digital revolution. Digits aren't fingers and toes, but ones and zeros in terms of how much of our day is spent interacting with ones and zeros, as we're doing at this moment. And so I've been very interested in this interface between the digital revolution, which I think has had huge changes on the way that we learn, the way that we play, the way that we interact with each other. That revolution's often overused hyperbole, but I think when we look back, this really will be seen as a revolution in human history and the amount of time that we spent interacting with screens and digital devices. So I've been very interested in this interface, in the digital revolution and the adolescent brain evolution. I focused on adolescence, not because adolescents are the only ones affected. 2-year-olds can meaningfully interact with iPads, and they also swipe like plants and refrigerators and stuff. But people beyond adolescence also use a lot of the digital technologies. But adolescents are sort of in this sweet spot. They're young enough to embrace the changes, but they're old enough to master the technologies. So even bright 14-year-olds can often run circles around even computer science teachers in their school. So I think this is a very active field right now in terms of looking at the digital technologies and how they affect the lives of teens in health and illness, their potential for recognition, intervention, and improving lives. But it's a very very fresh and active area. And often the fundamental question is this too much in terms of all the time with smartphones and so much of our lives interacting with screens? And like most interesting questions, the answer is it depends. And what it depends on and how it depends and what it depends on is the stuff of science and the details of the paper. But I wanted to look at it with a little more nuance in terms of the 3 domains of learning, play, and social. So the upside to learning is phenomenal in terms of immediate access to the best minds on the planet, TED Talks, Khan Academy, that it might not have sort of gone this way in terms of free access and almost ubiquitous access, but it has. It's just there's so many things that you can learn online, a click away. as an opportunity to meet each student exactly where they're at developmentally, personalized instruction. And to me, when I talk to my teenagers, I'm frustrated that they're not more amazed at that you can find out so much online, more so than kings and queens and president of government even 30 years ago. We have access to way more information than at any time in human history. There's a concern about the signal to noise in this vast ocean of information. How do we find the truth from the lies? How do we harness this information to solve problems, which I think is one of the fundamental goals of education and the change that's needed in education. We need to prepare our students for their future, not the present of their parents. And it's hard. It's hard to change this educational systems. Each generation that gets older and older, it's harder to adapt to the new technologies. But this, I think, is one of the fundamental challenges of our time. There's also a concern that the information is a mile wide and an inch deep, that people just skim the headlines, that it's all so immediate and fast, nobody did. And that could be the case, but there's not a lot of evidence that that's all that's happening. If you want to dig deeper, you can actually do it more efficiently. You can follow links. You can you can get access to other papers. So that may be some of it a risk, but it's not a given. And people, I think, underestimate how often people do dig deeper and can use the technologies to really improve the scholarship. But this is a big controversy in terms of whether this immediacy is dampening our skills of patience and persistence, and whether this will be a generational difference. The other aspect is multitasking in terms of that not only people have almost 11 hours of the day with screen time, about 30% of the time people are doing more than one thing. So you're doing your homework, but you're checking your Facebook status, listening to some iTunes, maybe eating some ice cream. So you're doing a lot of things at once. And so this has been another area of active research of whether this multitasking is having an effect on how the brain is developing, whether it's a skill that can be learned and improved. And the jury's still out. I mean, it seems to be clear that you can't do a whole bunch of things as well as you can one thing. This idea of a multitasking tax from Marcel Just at Carnegie Mellon, that you pay a price in metabolism, in time, in efficiency, but it's not a great tax. And we can look at a presentation on the internet, and maybe glance at some emails, do a few other things. We do it all day. Most people multitask a lot. And how often do you need to be just purely monotasking, focusing, doing your absolute greatest work? It might be nice sometimes, but it's probably rare that we have to really be at our 100% best for many tasks. But this is a big area of investigation in terms of, can we harness the brain's plasticity in the younger years? Can we learn to multitask better, or is it better to focus on the monotasking aspect of learning how to focus on one thing through meditation, through training, through practice? The other aspect of the digital revolution is play. These games are really fun. And the R&D on these has now surpassed militaries. Some of the most clever computer scientists in the world are working on games. There used to be the complaint that it'll turn people into couch potatoes, that the games are too passive. No longer true. With Wii Fit, Connect, these other devices, you can be as physically active as you want to adjust the settings for. You don't even need to hold things anymore. The technologies can look at where your head and elbows and knees and joints are, and interact with you without having holding the devices or to wear special clothing. It's just they're phenomenally engaging to the brain in terms of they play the brain's reward systems, masterfully. We have this sort of steady trickle of dopamine for novelty. People in bank lines, about 30 seconds, 80% of people will have a phone out, checking their phone. That we aren't very good at boredom anymore. And again, I'm not to judge that as good or bad, but it's so different. Our brains are used to having nearly constant stimulation. If we don't have access to it, we get uncomfortable. It feels unpleasant. And whether there's a downside to this in terms of sometimes boredom generates creativity and imagination and other things. So like almost everything I'll say about this, it's nuanced in terms of, but maybe you can have better imagination with the aid of the internet and other input. So I think that one of the issues is this kind of turning the brain to mush? Is there something wrong about having really fun games and easy access? I don't think it's so much that, and that it's just they're so fun that it'll take time away from homework. That there's only so many hours in the day. Almost always the games and the freedom to surf the net on your own terms is going to be more fun than homework. Exposure to sex and violence, it's ubiquitous. It'd be hard not to come across sexual content on the internet. Violence as well, so the amount of time with violent video games has gone up fourfold just since 2002. The degree of violence is limited really only by our imagination. It's gone kind of over the top. And so there's a lot of concern about this eroding the moral fabric of our nation, that the implications of this. And so it's been surprising that real-world sex and violence are at all-time lows in the U.S. So unwanted teen pregnancies, all-time low. Sexually transmitted diseases among adolescents, 47-year low. Abortions amongst adolescents as well, 47-year low. As is real-world violence in terms of since they've been measuring all-time lows. This is, if it was the other way, it would be all over this. Of course, this is, the cause of this. So it's generally puzzling in terms of people saying, yeah, they're not violent, they're not, mugging you in the street because they're in their basement, playing games. And there may be some truth to that, but it could be more profound that people are working through sex and aggression in virtual environments that aren't hurting other people. And these are part of the human condition. The prime directives. We need sometimes aggression to stay alive, to protect our family, our resources, our loved ones, and we need sex to propagate the species. So the idea isn't to eliminate these drives, but to keep them non-lethal and to make optimize the good and minimize the bad. But it's been interesting in terms of the concerns of how each generation that changes, it usually causes alarm amongst the existing generation going back to dime novels, TV, radio. This has always been the concern that something horrible is going to happen from these technologies. The other big aspect is social interactions. So about 25% of traffic is porn, 25% is social media, things like Facebook. I think it fills a profound human need in terms of what people really like to connect socially to these technologies. And one aspect of this is this idea of a more global community, where young people were watching the same internet videos, cats playing piano, or whatever the current ones are. But a lot of prejudice is ignorance. We don't understand other people, other cultures. And with all of us sharing a lot of the same content, we see that we're much more alike than different. People love their families. They want to do well by their parents and society. They may have different foods and religions and dress and cultures, but fundamentally we're a lot more alike than different. And this has been borne out in studies that where 17 to 21-year-olds are much more globally minded, they're less provincial, they are aware of what's going on in the world. And this could be a very nice upside to having a world of shared content. The downside in terms of that, there's just something wrong about interacting so much through screens, that we have evolved to be together, to smell the same things, to feel the same things, a very subtle facial expressions, that a lot of our brain is dedicated to social skills that we need to get along to stay alive, in terms of that's what our species did well. We're not the biggest, strongest, fastest, but working together in groups to stay alive and to reproduce. But that is just like it's very different in terms of, and are there going to be implications of spending so much of our time in such a different way? Cyberbullying is a big concern. Again, it happens. It's tragic, when it does. But it hasn't. There was bullying before the internet. There is I think, a growing recognition of the accountability that what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, but what happens on the internet is there forever. In terms of that, if there is bullying as well, it's traceable. You're accountable for it. So not to minimize that aspect. I think it's another sort of area of ongoing study. But that this genie is out of the bottle. We're not going to stop people from using technologies and the internet. And so fundamentally, I think a lot of the concerns come down to this notion that, as my grandmother would say, it's just not natural. There's something odd about spending so much time with these screens that we weren't evolved to do this. A counter argument to that is that reading's not natural either. Reading's only about 5,000 years old. So throughout most of human history, nobody read. And now a lot of us spend a lot of our waking hours with words or symbols. And 10,000 years ago, in terms of hunting, gathering berries, now this time reading, it's so different. And that's really my most fundamental point, that what the key is that the adolescent brain is changeable, that it can make these incredible adaptations. And this changeability is a double-edged sword. It does create some vulnerabilities, but also opportunities. And much of my career has been spent trying to understand this changeability, how the brain actually changes, what influences these changes in terms of diet, exercise, second languages, drugs, music, sports, all of the things that might influence brain development in health and illness. And the study design is pretty non-creative, admittedly. So you have people get their brain scanned now, you're actually in the womb, but at any time along life, have people come back at about 2 intervals. Nothing magical about that, just sort of pragmatics and logistics. A lot of studies are kind of these 2 intervals, and people come back and we do whatever the most current brain scanning is, get DNA from blood, saliva, or skin cells, and see how people are doing at home, at work, at school, doing behavioral assessments, doing clinical assessments. So these numbers are ever changing, but over 10,000 scans, about half of them healthy, typically developing youth, and half of those twins. And the other half from clinical populations such as ADHD, autism, child schizophrenia, depression, 25 other illnesses that we're looking at. So this is just a joke slide showing why MRI is better than CAT scans, because you can put a cat in an MRI. But really what is the advantage is that MRI scans don't use radiation. So not only can you scan healthy children, you can scan repeatedly over time. And this has really launched a whole new era of adolescent neuroscience. So if you take a brain out and clean it up a bit and put it on, I guess, a white tablecloth, it would look like this. But to an MRI machine, it just sees boxes of gray or white. These boxes are about 1 millimeter on a side. You can make them a little smaller if you have a more powerful magnet or have people spend longer time in the magnet. But for most of the literature, we're looking at a box of about 1 millimeter cubed, which contains maybe 5 million synapses. We're not sort of looking at the kitchen table of the neurons talking to each other. It's more like we're looking at a city as we're coming in from a plane. That we can say, oh, here's the business areas, shopping centers, residential. We can see certain things, but we have to be careful not to oversell what can be done with the neuroimaging. There's a strong temptation to do that, to like, oh, let's make humans simple and colorful pictures and movies, and try to get around all of the incredible subtleties of the human condition in terms of the legal system, no lie MRI, just do a brain scan to tell if someone's telling the truth or not, using for neuromarketing and stuff. And in general, maybe this will come up in the questions, I think it's better than a coin flip. We can do a little bit of that, but it's not nearly as far along as people think. So I just want to briefly now kind of summarize this results of over 25 years of how does the brain change from birth through childhood through adolescence into adulthood. And one of the surprising aspects was that the brain doesn't mature by getting larger and larger. By first grade, the brain's already 93% of adult size. And that was not obvious to us. We'll watch the brain grow, and if it's this big, oh, now you can do arithmetic. Oh, this big algebra, now this big calculus. And so it's almost kind of disappointing in some ways that, wow, we're going to be watching a 7% change over 30 years. It's not going to be very dynamic. And that actually has helped. The brain doesn't change that much. It reaches its peak size in girls by about 11 and boys by about 14. So it doesn't mature by getting larger and larger. How does it mature then? Well, one of the ways is that it becomes more interconnected. And the way that we can study how the brain is connected, one aspect is white matter. And so white matter is this fatty insulating substance from these cells called oligodendroglia, which is, sounds like it's a big word, but it's mini branch glue. And like an octopus, these cells send out this wrapping material more and more, about 1% to 2% a year, into the 5th decade for women, the 4th for men. So, but definitely throughout adolescence, this blue line is white matter for males, red is white matter for females. And this insulating material is not very subtle. It really, really helps. What happens if you look really closely between, to me they're like little hot dogs, the electrical signal can hop from gap to gap. And this really speeds things up 100 times faster with the myelin. And the other part is that the way this works is gates open up and positive ions outside can then rush past through the previously locked gates into the cell axon, and that's how the signal is propagated. A lot of the energy of our bodies, about 20–25%, is spent reloading these membranes. And so now we only have to reload at the gaps instead of all along the way. So the cells are ready to fire 30 times faster. That's a huge increase in bandwidth. 100 times the speed, 30 times to reload, a 3,000-fold increase. So this is responsible for many of the behaviors of humans and things that we can do uniquely well. But it's not just pedal to the metal, optimizing speed. It's all about the timing, because information in the brain is all about the patterns in terms of the networks and the firing. And so the myelin helps not just the faster the better, but in the exquisite timing of how different parts of the brain can communicate. So a brain cell in the front part of the brain will need to get information from the visual system in the back, from the auditory on the side, from the reward systems in the middle. And all of this information has to arrive at a very tight window, 50 millisecond window, 51,000ths of a second. Adds up all the yays, all the nays, decides to fire or not. But it's amazing it ever works. The timing is so critical. But a trade-off is that as the myelin is laid down, it releases molecules that prevent the plasticity, prevent further arborization and this change. So that's the trade-off as we go through the teen years. We have fewer but faster connections, the connections that we use that lead to good outcomes are reinforced, strengthened. The connections that lead to bad outcomes are physically removed. But it's this trade-off between specialization and plasticity. Overall, it's 1 to 2%, but there are certain parts of the brain where there's like dynamic activity, 50% in 1 year, and other areas that are slower. But this also gives us notion of sensitive or critical periods, where as we understand where the different parts of the brain are being most actively changed, this is when the environment may have its biggest impact, which has educational and interventional implications. But in general, the brain becomes more interconnected through the adolescent years. It's not just white matter. It's looking at, under the microscope, the physical connections. EEG coherence is when one part of the brain is electrically active, what other parts are active along with it. And same thing for fMRI activation, functional MRI, which looks at blood flow in the brain. But when blood flow is changed in one part of the brain, what other parts of the brain are increasing or decreasing related to that? There's this idea of cells that fire together, wire together, dating back to Donald Hebb in the 1940s, one of the maxims of neuroscience. But now we also see that cells that fire together, wire together, grow together. There's another aspect of connectivity. You could say, what parts of the brain are affected by the same genetic or by the same environmental factors? So all of these aspects of connectivity increase during adolescence and are being studied now by what for me is a relatively new type of math called graph theory. And graph theory looks at everything as a node or an edge. And this dates back to 400 years of Euler, the great mathematician, describing these nodes and edges, and this idea of a small world network. I don't have the audio working for this, but this idea of a small world. And what was surprising was that this math that arose from how computers could survive a nuclear attack, how you connect different computers around the world, that the ideal way to do this was sort of random. It wasn't completely random, but it wasn't as neat and orderly as you would think. But what really took off was that the same notion of how to connect different computers was so applicable to other things such as airlines, the stock market, the formation of galaxies, atoms. So that the same math applied to so many different things that this really revolutionized the field of trying to understand brain development, not so much as which chunk gets bigger or smaller, but how they're all connected. So it's like the different parts of the brain are like letters of the alphabet. And as you go from a baby to an adult, the letters get formed into words, the words into sentences, the sentences into paragraphs, and so on. But this new type of math has really helped us now go back to old data. This is an example of childhood schizophrenia, really rare, 1/500th is common as adult schizophrenia. And we look at the old ways of just saying which chunk of the brain is bigger or smaller or different shape. Not really able to tell them apart very well. But when we look at how the different parts of the brain are communicating, how they're connected, then with the exact same brain scans, the same input, now we can just separate schizophrenia from controls. Still at the group level, males from females, young from old. But it's a very new, exciting way of looking at things. One of the ideas of the fire together, wire together, grow together was that if we're looking at electrical activity in thousandths of a second, or blood flow in 3 to 5 seconds, or across decades, we see the same pattern of connectivity in terms of that different parts of the brain are connected. So it's a very robust finding, and now we can go back and look at relationships between how the brain is connected and things like a vocabulary ability, where two parts of the brain that grow together in terms of that their change over time is tighter, predicts ability for vocabulary. The other way that the brain matures is by becoming more specialized. And so these are both gardening metaphors. What you have is arborization, like arbor, the Latin word for tree, extra branches, twigs, and roots. Not more neurons. That's pretty much pretty stable around the time of birth. But we have this growth of arborization, more connections, and a pruning process then where only the useful and good ones survive. So both arborization and pruning, they're constantly occurring throughout life. It's not like all of childhood is building up and all of adolescence eliminating, but on balance, we see this change. And so this is Michelangelo's painting that building the brain is not like a painting. I use this example because this on the right is often looks like a brain to many people in terms of a side section, the temporal lobes, the brain. That's been written about quite a bit. And then this is described as the original synapse. Neuroscience humor. But it's not like that. That's not how the brain is built. It's much more like Michelangelo's other artistic outlet of sculpting in terms of we start with a block of granite, eliminate certain components to create the masterpiece. And so it's this 1-2 punch of overproduction followed by selective elimination that is how the brain becomes complex. It's really not even just the brain. It's how everything in nature, the complexity arises from this 1-2 process. Overproduce, fierce competition, fight it out, and then selective elimination. It's the engine of evolution. But what we find is that different parts of the brain mature and specialize at different rates. And the part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, is amongst the latest to reach adult levels. Not till like 25 to 30. That seemed like really late when we started these studies. So we follow people till they're 16 or 18. By 16, they're already winning medals in the Olympics. They're already quite advanced. Well, we'll play it safe. We'll overshoot, go to 18. 25 wasn't even on our radar screen. We somewhat joke that if you go to the airport to rent a car, you have to be 25. Pay really high insurance rates. And we're like, oh, no wonder neuroscience is suffering. Hertz has all the best neuroscientists, and we can't be making progress. But it didn't really go away in terms of like that. At this age, your immune system's the best, resistance to cancer, reaction times, tolerance for heat and cold. Almost anything you measure, you're at your top of your game. But morbidity and mortality go up 300%. So number 1, car accidents. 2 and 3, suicide, homicide. But all of the top 10 related to judgment, decision making. And so this really became a theme that the brain is still under construction through not just through the teen years, but well into the 20s. But again, a good thing, or we wouldn't be here in terms of the this ability to stay flexible, to be able to adapt, to change is essential for our survival species. But this is an aspect where it's not as good as it's going to get for things like long-range planning, controlling our impulses, having to organize and implement plans. And so this is a part of the brain right here that is still under construction for quite some time. And it's such an important part for the behaviors that we see. It's involved in things like time travel. So humans can imagine the past and the future, integrating things from the present. Kind of jargony, but things like counterfactuals, what ifs. We can play out different scenarios in our mind, and we get better and better at this into our 60s. More sort of scenarios can be run in our mind. The philosopher Karl Popper said this wonderfully, that our hypotheses die in our stead, that we don't have to fall out of trees and get eaten by animals so we can run these scenarios in our mind. And this is part of what the prefrontal cortex can help with. Not by itself, but as part of a node in a circuit. It's also what gets clogged up when you try to do multitasking. So when you do have people do things like driving while talking on cell phone things, this is a part of the brain that's even more vulnerable for adolescence. This is still being developed, and so multitasking is even greater risk for those sorts of things. But there are many implications for this in terms of this for voting, for making decisions about marriage, about sex, about career, about spouses. A lot of these decisions and happen before age 25. And we need to understand what influences in terms of what do we do as a parent, as a teacher, the effects of medicines, video games, exercise, all these things. They could affect this 1-2 punch of overproducing followed by selective elimination. The last point I want to make about the brain maturation, that it's not just a matter of the prefrontal areas being under construction for a longer time, that it's also related to a part of the brain called the limbic system, or the reward circuitry, that is activated at the time of puberty. They have a lot of hormone receptors, so around age 10 to 13, we have this explosion of development in these areas that intensify our passions, sex, aggression, social drives, and this kind of gap then between the early maturing limbic regions and the later maturing frontal regions account for many of the behaviors that we see. And the currency for these behaviors is dopamine. In terms of making a good decision, pleasure, dopamine goes up, reinforces those connections. Bad decision, pain, unhappiness, displeasure, dopamine goes down. Don't use those connections, don't keep those connections. And the dopamine is where it's a very primitive type of molecule. It's involved in many things: movement, motivation, reward, well-being, but also addiction. So all things that are addiction, they hijack this dopamine reward system. And in fact, everything that's addicted, from drugs to shopping, sex, and even things like sleep and hunger, they all affect the same fundamental reward system, increased dopamine in a small part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens. But I think it's why addictions can be so challenging to treat. It bypasses the frontal cortex, it bypasses things. It's a very fundamental attack on our reward systems. So the adolescents are particularly at risk during this time, when the reward system's being fine-tuned, being set. And so there's a lot of work, a lot of research now, kind of trying to understand why adolescence is a vulnerable time for addictions and what to do about it. Same things for eating disorder. Why does eating disorder only happen after puberty? That it's related to this ignition of the reward systems. But if we understand how these changes are happening in the dopamine systems, it might help us address many of these illnesses. So just about out of time, but just a few things about the influences. We are looking at twins, the kind of nature, and not nature or nurture, but nature-nurture type of questions of what parts of the brain are related to genes and environment at different times. And one of the findings that surprises a bit, that there's this lasting echo of early environments where even amongst totally healthy twins, that we can tell 30 years later which twin was heavier than the other twin. But the most fundamental thing we found was that it's a moving target. Different parts of the brain are more heritable at different ages. And this really needs to be addressed in all these studies of looking at genes and brain and behavior, because the answer changes. Things that are changing in teenage years become more heritable in adolescence, which surprised us in terms of the brain actually becomes more similar, even though each twin has different environments. But these are the same brain regions involved in schizophrenia and depression, in things that emerge during this time. The genes matter. This is one of the most profound, and a 4-fold increase in violent crime, 8-time increase arrested for murder, 50 times risk for being on death row. I made up the last one, but of course this is the Y gene and male-female differences, which isn't to say, well, who's better in the kind of but it's a huge clue and for the biology, because everything I study as a child psychiatrist is different between boys and girls, men and women, and to try to understand how these differences in healthy, typical male females might relate to the illnesses. But the brains of males and females overwhelmingly more alike than different. But these subtle differences do do have an effect. And I'm going to skip a few slides here just to get to the point that sometimes these differences are, really overplayed. Men are from Mars, men from Venus, and board games, these planetary style differences. Where this is where I'm from in North Dakota. There are differences, but to me they're much more subtle. So it's more like men are from North Dakota, women are from South Dakota. The differences are real, they're subtle, they're important, but that it's at a group level. And most of these differences are only in the path of brain development, not in the snapshots in time. So much of what we learn for differences between males and females, healthy and ill, relating to cognition or behavior, we really need to look at the path of brain development, not just a snapshot. My final point, though, is that this plasticity confers vulnerabilities. Most mental illnesses emerge during this time, not a few, not a lot, over 50%. And so this is critical time. Not everything, but there's a lot of clues here to understand why. If you're born at the risk for schizophrenia, why does it wait till you're a teenager to show up? Or depression, or anxiety, some sort of eating disorder. But not everything, not autism, not ADHD, not Alzheimer's. And so we're very interested in this interaction between typical changes for things like schizophrenia. All of the findings in schizophrenia could be predicted if you said, what happens if regular teen development goes too far? And this predicts the findings that you see in schizophrenia. And a lot of things that for adolescents is not really an illness, but they're very important. Unplanned pregnancies, sexually transmitted diseases, motor accidents, being arrested and put in jail, life decisions. And so adolescence is that, kind of this idea is that half empty, half full. Adolescents would say, well, people say, yeah, it's not only half empty, but the water's dirty, the glass is cracked, and it's your fault. But that's not all true, and there's enormous opportunity for people to harness this changeability, to have many different life courses. But most teens get through this. Most adolescents get through, they do well, they become productive adults. But if we understand this ability of the brain to change, and if we can harness this, we can do a lot to improve the lives of youth and their families. So I'd like to thank you very much for your attention and look forward to answering questions if I can.
Thank you for that informative presentation. Before we get started on the question and answer session, I'd like to remind the audience how to ask questions. You can submit questions by typing them in the Q&A box, which can be found by clicking on the green Q&A button in the lower left of the presentation window. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can. The first question is, has the mouse to human innate immune system model of receptor-mediated cell type differentiation been linked from fossilized teeth to ecological adaptation via brain development? Let me know if you want me.
So one of the, should I answer by text or? So one of the challenges of going from mouse models to humans is the prefrontal cortex itself, which is uniquely human. It's what's most different between us and bonobos and chimpanzees, our other close relatives. And so this has been one of the challenges in terms of the part of the brain that is sort of most interesting during adolescence, the prefrontal cortex, which matures the latest, which is most different between man and mouse, is particularly hard to study during these adolescent years.
Do you get more neurogenesis from exercise in teen brains compared to the young or older adults?
Exercise and neurogenesis, what a great question. It's unknown in terms of whether there's a pronounced effect during adolescence, but even with aging, so for Alzheimer's disease, dementia, the most effective treatment right now is exercise. And it's not just sort of the general stuff, oh yeah, we should all exercise and eat well and get enough sleep and stuff, that it has direct and known mechanisms on neurogenesis through intermediaries like insulin growth factor genes, and so it's a really active area right now in terms of looking at physical activity in the school systems, in interventions for depression, for anxiety, and it's one of the things that we're going to be focusing on in this new large study called ABCD, Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development, looking at 12,000 9-year-olds as they go through the second decade of life. But I think what's really been fascinating in recent years is that the effect of exercise on learning and on brain health is getting stronger and stronger. And it almost seemed like in some ways it was kind of almost like unscientific, right? It's like, oh yeah, everybody knows we should exercise more. But we're understanding much more of a direct and measurable link between body and brain in that respect. And for me, it's actually one of the most exciting areas. And now with things like Fitbit and with other sensors and stuff, we can get a much better quantification of physical activity of adolescence. And for the first time, we'll be able to answer this question with more data in terms of we can really look at the effects of movement exercise on mental illness, on health, on cognition, on behavior. But it's an insightful question.
In regards to the different levels of white matter in males and females, was this in one particular area or was it uniform all around?
Really good question. So really, before we used to think that it was more like uniform in terms of, but now we see that certain parts of the brain have more androgen male receptors, other parts have more estrogen female receptors, and that it's a moving target in terms of development. And so the question is just exact same question we were wondering about. Just as an example, so whether you have early puberty or late puberty, and it has such a broad range from 9 to 15 is all healthy, typical puberty. For something so important, you would think nature might have constrained it a little bit tighter. But whether you have had early puberty or late puberty doesn't affect your abilities on doing a Rubik's Cube, you're solving maze problems, on doing many math problems or things. That doesn't appear to be as affected by puberty and by male-female differences. Other things are affected more in the decision-making realm. And so if you're a male, then things that lead to sex, leading to prowess, are maybe more motivating. For females, social standing, other aspects. So for certain types of tests and certain types of decision-making, male-female differences are stronger. For other cognitive things, they're not. And so we're starting to separate this out a bit. But one of the things that we're trying to understand is that things that are more common in boys are all at birth, early in life. ADHD, dyslexia, autism, 4 to 1, 7 to 1, male if more severe, really different. It's not, not a little bit more. And then things that are more common in females, depression and panic attacks and anxiety, are only more common after puberty. And it is puberty. It's not age 12. It's literally after puberty. So that's a big clue in terms of why these changes. And so from mouse models and other things, we see that the hormones will affect stress response in females, but not male mice. And so we're seeing some of these differences in terms of even things like if you throw people out of a plane, if you throw men out, then their memory will be better for those instances and females not. So these kind of like, you give them parachutes actually, but these differences that we're just starting to appreciate a bit more. But we have to be careful because overwhelmingly more alike than different. And so for schools, they want to say, oh, it's like, teach girls this way and teach girls
this way. Use it or lose it. Did some teens grow like a bamboo tree or all grow in tight temporal chronological limits?
And it's not very tight temporal type of limits. And so this idea of overproduction and selective elimination of fighting it out is very, very powerful in terms of the use it or lose it, I think, holds throughout life, but particularly, well, so I'll just say throughout life, because in childhood it's very powerful, but in adolescence as well. And if we can understand when, to practice sports or different cognitive skills and stuff, it's very powerful. But the ability of the brain to change based on the use it or lose it is really powerful. It's really that the genes and our biology set a pretty broad, playing field, but what we do with the brain really makes a huge difference in what it ends up to being specialized in.
Has your work addressed the effect of amino acid substitutions on social brain development and effects on behavior during life history transitions?
So that's an area that I haven't personally been involved in, and I'd have to do some research, to see. It'd be interesting in terms of, in some ways, with the social cognition, it's so broad. There, so much of the brain is dedicated to social interactions, but that in nematode worms and simple systems, one tweak to one amino acid can actually change them from being social to not social. So that was one of the most intriguing findings of recent years. We thought, oh, this is going to be so complicated. It'll be 1,000 genes and everyone contributing a very tiny amount. And so it doesn't always work that way. Sometimes amino acid switch that seems such a low-level molecular change can actually have profound differences in very, very complicated behaviors. The most complicated of all behaviors, social interactions. And there's so many gaps between molecules and cells and circuits and behavior that the future people that can cross these gaps are going to be super valuable to understand molecular biology, but also social cognition. I think it'd be a really fun area for younger people to be involved in.
For a given stress, the pattern of change in the amygdala and hippocampus can be different. While the hippocampus can shrink in volume, the amygdala can increase in size. Can you explain the underlying mechanism for this different pattern of change?
The hippocampus is very responsive to stress, cortisol levels, and that it's an interesting part of the brain in that it generates new brain cells after birth. There's only a few areas that do that. The olfactory system and part of the cerebellum and this part of the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is very responsive to the environment. It's sort of involved in memory, acquisition, storage, retrieval. It needs to sort of stay flexible in terms of it needs to stay responsive to the environment. And so many illnesses that have stress, like depression, schizophrenia, it's a very common target to be affected by these sort of changes. And it has both male and female hormone receptors, but it has a preponderance of estrogen type of receptors. The amygdala is more involved in what's important in the environment. It's not just sort of threats, but sort of what's salient, what's really important for the brain to attend to. And it's also built to change a lot during adolescence in terms of with the changes in hormones and different priorities in terms of reproducing and in terms of becoming independent, of needing to be aggressive at times to protect you and your loved ones. And so both the amygdala and hippocampus are very, very active in decision making and what the brain focuses on in the environment. And we're just getting a early understanding of what actually happens in terms of making the changes in the size of these structures, but they're surprisingly dynamic during adolescence.
Thinking about teen brains as a work in progress, what is your point of view about trying to improve PFC function with prescribed medications? Could it bypass the natural progression and create areas that won't be connected in the long term?
Interesting question of that. When we think about the prefrontal cortex being under construction for a long time, to try to fix that, to try to make that better, I think it's the wrong way to go. That the prefrontal functions, they are really important for success in life. Self-regulation, doing the hard thing, waiting for larger, later rewards versus sooner, smaller, is one of the things that's very predictable as we go from childhood to adolescence to adulthood. We are much better at waiting for larger, later rewards as the prefrontal cortex matures. But this idea of sooner is better is one of the things that the biology and the neuroscience has really questioned. That is it always better to do things early? And this has huge implications for the educational system in terms of countries like Finland that teach reading not till age 7 versus countries that teach at age 4. And then in Finland, the students actually end up doing better on many measures by age 11 in terms of that earlier isn't always better. And so I think that there's a balance here in terms of if I were to try to improve prefrontal connections and maturation, I would much rather focus on behavior in terms of meditation, of being good at a sport or a musical instrument or school, of using perhaps computer interventions, video games, or software that can help improve our ability to delay gratification, to find patterns. Pattern recognition is another huge important skill for the future. But of all the interventions, for me, medicines would be the last, in terms of I think that the brain is very responsive to the demands that we ask of it during this time. And that perhaps, someday with the right amount of data, we could say, yeah, this actually, medicine might help in this area. But I would recommend 1,000 things first before going to a medicine intervention. But I think it's so key if we could understand.
Sorry about the that little cutting you off there. Computer did that. I would like to once again thank Dr. Giedd for his presentation. Do you have any final comments, Dr. Giedd?
To end more, on this positive note, because teens, they get bashed a lot, and even amongst teens themselves, they consistently underrate themselves on their contributions to community, on the positive aspects, and that this is a time that is just loaded with opportunity. That if we can challenge the brain in the right ways, it's going to adapt incredibly. And so even though I concede this is a time of vulnerability to depression, anxiety, substance abuse, psychosis, that we don't lose sight of the positive aspect. This is also a great time for positive change.
Thanks again. Today's webcast will be available for on-demand viewing through September 2016. You'll receive an email from LabRoots alerting you when this webcast will be available for replay. We invite you to forward that announcement to your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. See you next time. Goodbye.